Yep.
There's the student.
We like everyone. We don't. Because we like everyone.
Oh, yeah, that's a great camera you've got. So hello, Mr. Diane.
We're recording. We're ready to go. We're just waiting for our 8:30 folks to come in. All right. Should we start with prayer? We're ready to begin.
Yeah, sure. Oh, I'd love to start with a prayer. Just let's bow our heads. Others, you're going to introduce Robbie?
I will.
Yeah, great.
Let me pray first.
Absolutely. What a special day. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Loving God, this is the day that you have made, and we rejoice and are glad in it. We're grateful for Robbie, his many gifts, his willingness to share them with us today, and for this group who are gathered here in this sacred space in this church, and all those around the country who are gathered over Zoom. We ask that the Spirit might be with us as we gather, as we open hearts and minds to this challenging and incredibly important topic, the next step on the continuing journey we as a congregation, a denomination have. May we be blessed and draw closer to you and each other in peace, in justice, in compassion, and empathy, and love as a result of this time. For it's in Christ that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of the Adult Education Lay Ministry and the Racial Justice Coordinating Committee, it's our pleasure to welcome you back to Bradley Hills, Robbie.
Thank you. Yeah, glad to be back.
Jones. Yeah. He'll be delivering today the 2024 Susan B. Andrews Lecture. And Robert P. Jones is the president, the founder of Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy in the Path to a Shared American Future, published in September last year, as well as White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award. He's also the author of The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. He writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for the Atlantic, Time, Religion News Services, and other outlets. He's frequently featured in major news national media, such as CNN, MSNBC, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc. He writes a weekly newsletter, which I highly would recommend for those dedicated to the work of truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity at www.whitetolong.net. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University, a master's in divinity from Southwest Baptist Theological Seminary, and a BS in computing science and mathematics from Mississippi College. You need to know that. Since our time is limited to this hour, Robbie will be sharing the highlights of the book, and then he'll be giving us the opportunity to question him further. As you hear him talk, think about the questions that you have. If you're joining us remotely, we welcome those to post those in the chat, and we'll do the best to manage the discussion as we go along. We have some new technology today. It does pick up on a lot of sound in the background, but it projects quite well. So bear with us, and we're just so excited to have you. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Oh, I lost them.
I don't have any slides today, so it's just me. But I think it also tells you something about how the work has evolved over time, right? From a little more demographics and heavy sociology to a little more history as I've kind of been on this journey. I'll talk a little bit about that. But before I jump in, I want to say, I don't think there's any more important venue to have conversations like this than local congregations. So like I do a lot of speaking at colleges and universities and seminaries, and all of those are, and other kind of civic spaces, all those are really important, museums and stuff. But I really become convinced that local congregations are really the most important place for these conversations to start and to continue. They're people in community with some accountability and kind of moving, and can kind of move forward. And I think particularly congregations that are, you know, full of highly educated, relatively well-connected people, right? It means that there are spokes out into the community, into business, into government, into NGO spaces, that conversations like this can help seed and spread in other places as well. So anyway, thanks for having me. What I'm going to do is try to just give you a little bit of an overview of the book. I know some of you have read it, some of you have heard me speak other places, but so I'll try not to be too repetitive, but I do want to set the table just a little bit so that for those who aren't familiar with the book have a sense of it. So I'm going to start actually with a story that I lead the book off with, because I think it illustrates the kind of integrated story that I'm trying to tell. And part of what I'm up to in this book is trying to kind of move the conversation around racial justice, social justice, to be more inclusive. And that is to not only be a kind of black-white lens that we bring to this, which is often what we do, but to kind of remember there is this other story that has to do with the indigenous people that were in this country before any Europeans ever landed on these shores. And how does that fit, right, into these broader conversations about racial justice and social justice, and what our obligations are in those areas. So I'm going to start with the story. It's kind of a remarkable story. I did not know before I started doing the research for the book. And it is from May 4th, 1863. All right, so May 4th, 1863. The steamboat Northerner pushed up the Mississippi River from St. Louis, bound for Fort Snelling, a military outpost north of St. Paul, Minnesota. Just a few miles into the journey, Alfred J. Woods encountered a large handmade raft adrift in the strong currents. Aboard were 76 African Americans, 40 men, 10 women, and 26 children. The leader of this determined group was Robert Hickman, who was attempting to free himself, along with his family and neighbors, from enslavement on a plantation in Boone County, Missouri. Hickman, a preacher who could both read and write, had seen newspaper accounts of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 4 months earlier. Although the proclamation did not apply to Missouri because it was under Union control, this news nonetheless inspired him to begin making plans to escape north. The Hickman party aimed to reach free soil by way of the river, which was by then safely patrolled by the Union Army. They embarked under cover of darkness on the moonless night of May 3rd, but because their makeshift craft was not equipped with sails or oars, they drifted for a day in the wrong direction before encountering the Northerner. Seeing the floundering party with so many children on board, Captain Woods asked if they needed assistance. Sympathetic to their plight and knowing that the strains of the Civil War had left Minnesota with a labor shortage, Woods ordered the raft to be securely tied to the steamboat and offered to take them as far as his final destination. Neither Woods nor Hickman anticipated the vitriol that awaited them. On May 5th, the Northerner approached the levee in Lower Town on the outskirts of St. Paul. As local dock workers, mostly Irish, caught sight of the self-emancipated African Americans, commonly referred to as contraband by whites, on the trailing raft, they became increasingly agitated, seeing them as competition for jobs. As word spread, a threatening crowd gathered on the levee. The commotion was so great that St. Paul police arrived on the scene. But after assessing the situation, the police sided with the mob and threatened to arrest not the Irish rabble-rousers, but the black asylum seekers, should they disembark. Captain Woods ordered the boat with his trailing raft to steam on to Fort Snelling. There, Hickman and his party came ashore without incident on May 5th, but they were met with an unexpected sight. Hundreds of disheveled Native Americans were huddled together, forcibly assembled near the docks. The desperate and anxious crowd they encountered were part of an original group numbering more than 1,600, mostly women, children, and elderly Dakota people, who had been held under armed guard all winter, following the Dakota War of the year before, in a miserable encampment in a lowland area below Fort Snelling. Unbeknownst to them, Minnesota government officials and military leaders were awaiting the spring thaw that would allow for their mass deportation downriver from their ancestral homelands to a bleak reservation in Nebraska territory. By the time the ice finally melted and the river levels rose, hundreds had died. A group of 770 Dakota people had been shipped off the day before on another steamer, the Davenport. Having set the Hickman party safely ashore and unloaded the wagons and supplies for the military fort, Captain Woods ordered preparations to receive his next cargo, 547 Dakota people, whom he was transporting for the fee of $25 per head, plus 10 cents a day for sustenance. Soldiers from Fort Snelling herded the ragtag remnant aboard the Northerner like so many cattle, as one observer put it. As they pulled away, a local minister's wife remarked, "May God have mercy on them, for they can expect none from man." Neither Hickman nor his companions nor the Dakota people would have had the perspective to realize they were witnessing the momentous final chapter of both chattel slavery in the U.S. and Indian removal in Minnesota. They would not have grasped the paradox the two groups represented that afternoon on the banks of the Mississippi River, that the end of bondage for Hickman's band also marked the last vestige of sovereignty for the Dakota people. And they would certainly have been unaware of that in the closing weeks of 1862, just 5 months earlier. President Lincoln was simultaneously considering two documents that would dramatically change the fates of each group: a warrant for the mass execution of 38 Dakota men and the Emancipation Proclamation. This encounter on May 5th, 1863 contains multiple narrative streams, each of which tells a different story about America. The question is, which do we follow? Do we tell the story of Fort Snelling, the military outpost established to protect the westward expansion of settler colonialism? Do we embark back down the Mississippi River to Missouri and the story of enslaved Africans in the South? Do we push upriver from St. Paul to its headwaters in the stories of indigenous peoples populating the land for millennia? Or do we portage east and across the larger waters connected to the homelands of Europeans who first set foot on these shores just a few hundred years ago? Each narrative pushes back to a different beginning. So I start the book with that story, again, which I didn't know myself and didn't come into into my own consciousness until the middle of doing research on Minnesota, because I think it does kind of hold together these two stories really well, that we tend to keep fairly separate in our own minds. They're often separate in curriculum. I just found out about your connection to Eastern, and my son is taking U.S. history at Eastern Middle School right now, and they are they have an AP history book that they're using, which is actually quite good, but they're actually supplementing it with an indigenous history of the United States, right? So trying to hold both of these stories together. So there are places where this is actually happening. Florida, not so much, but in Maryland, it is indeed happening. And trying to hold these stories together, I think, are really important, and they're important particularly for people who look like me, right? Because I think for many of us, we kind of hold those things in little silos in our heads, and we don't really think about our responsibility to both of those stories and how we have benefited, I think, from the way both of those stories have gone in the U.S. So, in some ways, the book is kind of addressing what I've come to think about as America's contemporary identity crisis that we're so seeing in our lives today. So, it's remarkable to me. So in my day job, I do public opinion polling, right? So Public Religion Research Institute, we survey 75 to 80,000 Americans a year on a whole range of issues around the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. And one of the things we've seen really since 2016 is that the divisions in the country are less and less about issues and more about identity. Right, that's the kind of key thing, right? I remember, so we do this survey with the Brookings Institution. E.J. Dion and Bill Galston are kind of our two big partners at the Brookings Institution. And I remember sitting around the table in 2016 and trying to kind of think, well, what issues are really driving the election this year? What should we be polling about? Is it abortion? Is it, LGBTQ rights? And we all kind of realized, no, it's actually about who is an American, who is a real American. Like, those are the real divisive issues. And so it gets fought out in these other things, but at the deep root of it, it really was this. And one of the things this book, I think I've tried to put forward, is that we have this identity crisis because there's a fundamental question that we have never fully answered. And it goes actually back to before the founding of the Republic, right? And it goes actually back to when the first Europeans set foot on these shores. And there was a fundamental idea that came with them when they set foot on these shores. And that idea was this claim that these lands were designated by God to be a kind of promised land for European Christians. Like that's as straightforwardly as the claim can be made. And that idea has been with us, and it has survived the Constitution. It has survived, all of our kind of development as a country, and we are still wrestling with that question. Like, are we a pluralistic democracy where everybody stands on equal footing, regardless of race or religion, before the law and the Constitution, or are we a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians? Like, I still feel like that in many ways is the fundamental dividing point that we're still wrestling with today. So I've been on a bit of a journey, as I'm guessing many of you have been as well, particularly if you look like me, and trying to kind of wrap my head around these kinds of divisions, and particularly for me. So I'm someone who grew up. There's a little bit about me. Some of you who heard me before, this will not be a surprise, but so I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi as a Southern Baptist, right? My family goes back 6 generations to Middle Georgia. Most of us Baptists. There's a few Methodists thrown in for good measure, but mostly Baptists. No Presbyterians that I know of in the family tree. But it's, and the most prized possession I have in my most prized family possession is actually a Bible. Right, there's a passed down on my mother's side of the family from the early 1800s. The Bible was printed in 1815, and it belonged to the first family that came down from Virginia to Georgia. And now, how do we get there? And this is kind of part of my own journey. I kind of knew this Bible existed because it was like everybody, the thing. And my mother actually gave it to me when I went to seminary. So it's sitting. I live in Tacoma Park. It's sitting on my shelf in my study in Tacoma Park, and it's remarkable. Like it begins between the Old and New Testaments. It has this genealogical pages, right? And it's got the records of about 3 generations of my mother's family, telling the story from their coming down from Virginia to Georgia, and then they were there. In fact, my brothers and sister and I are the first people on my mother's side of the family in 200 years not to live in either Twiggs County or Bibb County, Georgia, right around Macon. So that's kind of how dense those roots go. But I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. My parents kind of moved. They both grew up in Macon, moved to Jackson, Mississippi, went to public school there, and went to a Baptist college there. And so part of my journey has been sorting out, using kind of my professional tools, right? Sociology, doing more and more history. But how do I understand the entanglement of white supremacy and this faith that I hold dear? Right, and still continue to hold dear and wrestle with. How do I hold those two things together? Because in this Bible, right, and these families, what I found out through doing genealogical research is that I have this Bible and all these names. I also have a page printed out from a genealogical website that has an estate settlement from that first family that arrived down there, and listed among their earthly goods. And it's very detailed. It's like, 1 feather bed, 1 table, 6 chairs, 1 bay mare, and then there are 4 human beings listed on this estate settlement, right? And they're by name, right? It is written there on a line. It says, a woman named Naomi at $400, right? And just right under a bed at $100, right? And it's just right, and then it goes on, right? There's 4 human beings, and then it goes on to other just like objects in there. And so holding those two things together, right? That this family that could so cherish their faith, right, and take care of this Bible and pass it down is the same family that did see no contradictions, right, between holding and enslaving others on the basis of the color of their skin. I also, as I said, grew up Southern Baptist, and that, by the way, is still the largest Protestant denomination in the country. And its legacy is that it was founded in 1845 to make enslaving other people compatible with the gospel, right? That's its Genesis story, right? And it is still, again, the largest expression of Protestant Christianity in the country is the denomination that has that as its Genesis story. And then the other piece of the puzzle that I really began to put together as I began to work in this book is, so why did they come from Virginia to Georgia? in the early 1800s. Like, what was going on? And I actually have also a kind of facsimile of their receipt from a land lottery. They actually got free land when they came down from Virginia to Georgia, and they got 200-acre plots. Like, there was a kind of extended family, and each one of them got a 200-acre plot. Well, what's going on in Georgia? Well, it's Indian removal season in Georgia, right? And it was the Trail of Tears, and so it was the forced, violent genocide and removal of Native Americans from Georgia, shipping them off to Oklahoma, and once those lands were cleared by force and by violence, they were carved up into nice, neat little rectangles and handed out for free for families like mine, right? So, kind of telling that story and wrapping my head around that again, like, there's no hint of anywhere in my family history that even that was problematic. It was just our good fortune, right, to come down and to inhabit this land. And again, kind of linked to this promised land idea. So the journey I've been on, I think, is trying to kind of sort this out. And I didn't really intend to write 3 books on white supremacy and Christianity. It was never like my plan. Never written on that before. But in 2016 was the first book called The End of White Christian America. I think I'll just give a quick arc here because they've turned out to be kind of a unintended trilogy. But that book was kind of a data-driven book. It's heavy on demographic change. And I think I talked about that book here, actually, before, where I had a bunch of slides, right, with a bunch of charts and graphs and that kind of thing. And there, the basic thing is, like, one way of understanding the identity crisis is because of the way the country is changing demographically, right? And the key number there, and I can give you a little update, was I was writing then about the shift that we had gone from being a majority white Christian country to one that was no longer a majority white Christian country, just demographically speaking. That as recently as the early 2000s, again, not that long ago, or a couple decades ago, the country was majority white and Christian. So if you took all Protestant, Catholic, non-denominational people identified as white and non-Hispanic, it was 54% white and Christian in 2008. By the time we get to 2016, and that book was using 2014 data, actually, that number had gone from 54% to 47%, right? So just between 2008 and 2014. So we crossed this kind of sea change moment, this milestone in the country's identity. By the way, that number today is 42, right? So we've gone from 54 to 42% white and Christian. And it's that shift, even if people don't know the numbers, but I think I feel it, right? Feel it in the grocery stores, feel it in what languages are on the radio dial, feel it in what their kids' preschools look like and public schools look like. People feel this shift, right? And and I think the important thing is it's not just about race and ethnicity. It's an ethno-religious claim to dominance that shifted, right? So it's being white and Christian. It's not just being white, but it's this kind of ethno-religious dominance. This is a white Christian country. Again, back to the kind of early claim on the shore. So that book was kind of tracing that. And then in White Too Long, I did a lot of the history of my own family story that I told just a little bit of there, and trying to kind of sort it out. And the main findings there, I was like, well, if that's the history, how embedded is white supremacy still in white Christians' psyche? And so we came up with a index that we could measure attitudes on white supremacy, and particularly around denials of systemic racism, right? Just denying that any of this past has anything to do with the present. And we measured white supremacy using that set of tools. What we discovered is, and we standardized the scale on like 0 to 10, right? So 10 was holding the most racist views, 0 was holding the least racist views, and found that, like, no surprise, my people, the white evangelical world scored 8 out of 10 on this scale, right? With 10 again being holding the most racist views, denying systemic racism exists. But here's the catch, right? That white Catholics, who have their own history of discrimination in the country, scored 7 out of 10. And your good people, the mainline, the non-evangelical world, scored 7 out of 10 on that same scale. If you take white Americans who are not Christian, right, who do not identify as Christian, they score 4 out of 10. And we looked at all kinds of controls, and like what was remarkable about those findings is that even if you control for things like partisanship, education levels, things we know affect these views, right? Gender, region of the country, even controlling for all that, those things held. Right, those findings held. They didn't disappear just because of differential education levels. And in fact, I concluded in there that, like, the kind of heartbreaking thing is that what the data suggests is that if you take your average white American and you add Christian identity, it moves them up the racism scale, not down, right? From that book. And so this book is, I think, trying to take all of that and go back, right? And so where does this come from? How can we trace this history? Where do we trace it to? And I'll just say a little bit about that, and then I want to make sure we have some time for discussion. But say a little bit about that. The main thing I want to talk about is this thing called the doctrine of discovery, which is actually remarkably new to me. I've got a PhD in religion. I can't tell you how many religious history courses I've taken, how many American history courses I've taken, and I think I had heard the term, but it in no way got presented to me as some central thing that I ought to pay attention to, right? In terms of how the current country is, what we're wrestling with, how the divides are going. So I'm going to say just a little bit about that, because I do think it is key to kind of understanding the identity crisis that we're continuing to wrestle with. Now, it's important because I think we are understanding that some of our biggest fights are, again, not been about policy, they've been about identity. And one primary example of that is the 1619 Project, right? So most of you are probably aware in some way of the 1619 Project, first published in the New York Times, in a special edition of the New York Times, and then now it's a book and a whole curriculum. But it basically tried to displace this idea that the country began in 1776 with a bunch of white guys and their colonial finery and their quill pens in Philadelphia, right? So if you think about it, there's a painting we've all seen of people posed awkwardly around that table, right, where you can all see them in the frame, and they're all in their knickers and they're signing the Declaration of Independence. But trying to kind of move us out of that idea and to give us a different image, right? And it not only gives a different date, not 1776, but 1619, but a different image, right? So not those white guys in a small room in Philadelphia as the beginning of the country, but I don't know if you remember, can you recall the image that was there with the original 1619 Project? Yes, it was an ocean. It was this stark kind of monochromatic view, and it was like this long horizon line with this dark ocean at the bottom and a kind of grayish sky at the top, right? And the idea was a single boat, right, coming over, bringing people who were destined to be enslaved. They were technically indentured servants at the time, but they're against their will, brought to the British colonies in America. And that's a different kind of beginning story. Now we're here in church, right? And we know the power of Genesis stories, right? So the sacred texts begin with, how do we get here, right? And that sets the tone for all that follows, really. So in the beginning, God, right? That's the kind of monotheistic claim at the beginning, and it really has set everything else. And in a similar way, I think, if we're telling an American story, in the beginning, what? Right? How do we understand the American story? And we go very different ways depending on what's in that frame when we say in the beginning, what? And so part of the contribution I'm trying to make here is to say a kind of yes and to the 1619 Project, right? To say, yes, it was hugely important in displacing those white guys in Philadelphia from being the only thing in the frame when we tell the beginning of the American story. But what's notable about it, what many Native American people actually pointed out when the 1619 Project got so much traction, is that, well, wait a minute, there's a century of European interaction with indigenous people that happens before 1619, right? And how do we understand that here? So I'm kind of proposing that we sort of take the work 1619 did and say yes, 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 and then continue to bring the lens back, right? So that we go back at least to, and there's no magic date here. I'm guessing I think I know there are historians in the room, right? So we know that dates are kind of often artificial kind of handles for us to kind of grasp the flow of history. But I'm going to suggest another date that we ought to have in the beginning kind of stories, and that is 1493. That's right, not two. Not the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but 1493. I need to come up with another rhyme to kind of make this work, but I haven't done that yet. But 1493. So what happens in 1493, right? It's Columbus goes back, right? And he goes back not only with some things that he stole, but with some people that he stole, right? To present back to his benefactors and say, look at all this. And I want to go back. And what I need is I need more ships. I need more soldiers. I need more priests and missionaries. But the other thing that I think has gone, I think, largely unknown, or not unknown, but kind of people haven't paid attention to it, is that he needs something else. He asked all that from the King and Queen of Spain, but he asked for something else. He asked for a moral mandate for what he's about to do. And he asked for that from the church, right? And at the time, lest all of us who are Protestant get too smug here, that this was before the Protestant Reformation, right? There are no Protestants in the world. If any of you are British and Anglican, it is before the break with the Church of England. So there are no Anglicans or Episcopalians in the world. We're all Catholic in Western Europe, right? And so he appeals to the Pope in Rome for this moral mandate. And what happens then is there is this kind of whole set of theological kind of frenzy that happens because of first European contact with the Americas. So it begins in the middle of 1400s to 1493, and the 1493 is actually the culmination of a whole set of theological work that's been done over the past 50 years that came collectively to be called the Doctrine of Discovery. And it would be issued in these papal bulls that were basically answering the question, what rights do these people that we had no idea existed, what rights do they have that we're bound to respect? That was the basic theological conundrum, because they were literally not on the map. The lands were not on the map, but the people were not on the map. And so it blew up an entire Christian worldview, right? And so they had to kind of make room and figure out, well, theologically, what does this mean? And they came up, these doctrines of discovery were about doing that. And they essentially, there's actually a great website called doctrineofdiscovery.org. You can read them in Latin, you can read them in English. If you want to kind of go back and look at them, there's a whole collection of them. But what is remarkable is you boil down all the fancy theology, it essentially amounts to this. They answered that question with their own question. Well, and the question was, well, are they Christian? And of course, they knew the answer to that question, right? The answer was no. And if the answer was no, then a whole bunch of things just fell out. It meant that if they were not Christian, then European Christian powers had the right to steal their land, to take their goods. And then in the document written from the office of the Pope is this phrase, and to submit their persons to perpetual slavery. Right, that is in the papal documents issued to give the kind of rights there, and that sets off really the whole colonial posture, right? And it is deeply embedded in Christian theology, and I think that's the thing to kind of remember, that this does not get off the ground without this moral mandate from the church, right? That gives the political powers the cover that they need to kind of move with the not only just with the kind of political and economic exploitation, but now they have a moral mandate and moral cover to do it, and that comes really from the church. So I won't say a lot more than that, but I will bring this up to date as I did in the last book. And so you may think, okay, well, what does a dusty 15th century Catholic doctrine really have to do with us, right? Today, that seems pretty far off and kind of pretty far back there. Just a couple of things. This idea, again, the idea is essentially America as a Christian promised land, right, for European Christians. That's the core theological claim here inside the Doctrine of Discovery. So immediately some things should come to mind. Manifest destiny, right? City set on a hill. All of these things are kind of embedded in this kind of claim. It is in the Declaration of Independence, right? We think of that document is not devoid, but if you read the whole thing, there are these grievances against the king. And two of the grievances are about the king's interference in their oppression of African Americans and in their oppression of Native Americans, right? That's a complaint against the king in the Declaration of Independence. He says, the king, has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored, that's slave rebellions, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. That's the description of indigenous people in the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution also, Section 2, famously excludes Indians and counts at all from rights, and counts as enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, but not for the person increasing their power, but for their white owners' power, right? In the Constitution. And then finally, for those attorneys in the room, Johnson v. McIntosh, 1823, the Supreme Court incorporates the doctrine of discovery into U.S. case law. Chief John Marshall says this: the character and religion of the New World's inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. The potentates of the Old World found no difficulty in convincing themselves that they had made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the New by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity. Right, so that's the trade. Right, we give them civilization and Christianity, we take the land. Right, that's the fair trade that's there. So it's all there, and you know, and it also comes up to the present as late as a 2005 Supreme Court decision, actually written majority opinion written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg against the Oneida Nation. Footnote 1 cites the doctrine of discovery as justification for the ruling. So it's there all the way to the 21st century. And then finally, I'll kind of stop with this. That we went out and did some polling last year to kind of see, and we're about to release some in 2 weeks on the same topic, but try to figure out, like, all right, well, how much traction does this have in the general population today, this idea? And we just literally put it out there as straightforward as we could. The core tenet of the doctrine of discovery: do you agree or disagree that God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians? Right? Agree or disagree? So it turns out that 30% of the country agrees with that statement. So on the one hand, you think, okay, well, it's 2-1 rejecting that statement. That's maybe some good news. But there are two groups where there is a majority that affirms that statement. One of them are kind of my people, white evangelical Protestants. 54% agrees with that statement. The other one are self-identified Republicans. 56% agree with that statement today. So it is still very much with us. And I think part of the big partisan rifts that we're seeing today, because it goes to identity, it goes to who the country, you know, are we, is this a country of, by, and for white Christians, or is it something else, a kind of more pluralistic democracy? So in the book, I do, just in closing, we can talk about this, but I do go down to the local level. That's kind of the big national frame, but I go down the local level and look at Oklahoma, Missouri, and Mississippi, and try to look at the ways that this history kind of works its way up through like all the way up through pre-statehood all the way up to the present, and then what local communities are doing, and I think some inspiring stories of what local communities are doing to kind of wrestle with this legacy and bring about some justice and some healing in their own communities. But I'll stop there. We can talk about more about that. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Your book is so rich. So we have lots more to talk about. This is not the end of the discussion. I had a brief question that I think is a follow-up there. Was part of the doctrine of discovery to turn indigenous people into Christians. I think that was supposedly, yes, but it was also an excuse.
Yeah, I mean, conversion was certainly a key part of it. And what's remarkable too is that, you know, we've all seen those paintings, right, of the European explorers planting the flag, right, like putting it in the ground, right. They're all gathered. Sometimes they're kneeling, right. And then you'll also see, actually, in the Capitol Rotunda today, there is a painting of Hernando de Soto, right, first person to reach the Mississippi River. It's one of only 8 paintings in the massive 8 by 12 feet in the Capitol Rotunda today. And there's not only the flag, but there is a priest reading from a document, and they are erecting this gigantic, like 20-foot cross in the middle of an indigenous village, right? And so there you have all the elements of the doctrine of discovery. And what was remarkable is that those things weren't just, I always thought, I think when I saw those paintings, oh, well, they're praying because they're just thankful for a safe journey, or they're thankful, right, that they're there and alive. But those were actually rituals of domination. Right. Again, and they were actually thinking that by doing this ritual, they were literally claiming the land in the name of God for the political powers, right, that they were representing. So the political flag and the cross like went up together, and they were like making legal claims by doing those rituals. So it's kind of remarkable.
Yeah, they continued. I know Cortez moving into Montezuma and Yeah, this was the ritual.
Yeah.
Not that the Indians could, the Native Americans.
Well, right, they were reading
Understand anything that.
there was a document called the Requiremento, and they would read it in either Spanish or Latin. Of course, there's people there, no idea what they're saying, but the document says, and by hearing this document today, you were agreeing, boom, 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 right? And it was like that you are now the subjects of the king, right? And all of this stuff. And of course, had no idea, right, what they're, yeah.
As we slide into the role of the church, my first question would be, you highly recommend that we stop using a lot of the quotes from I Have a Dream and read the letter from the Birmingham jail. Do you want to elaborate?
Sure, yeah. So we're in February, right? So we're just past, not too long ago, celebrations of Martin Luther King Jr. And I kind of noticed that particularly in white churches, predominantly white spaces, that the King sort of gets sanitized, right? And he gets read, like the I Have a Dream speech is what gets read. And so that's, lofty and all of that. And only parts of that actually get read, right? It's the more aspirational things that get read. But I think what many white Christians don't take into account is the fairly harsh and honest things he had to say about white churches. And that's from a letter from Birmingham jail. I mean, I would put up there with Lincoln's second inaugural address, right? As like kind of documents of like the American DNA that we really ought to have on our short list of things that every kid should read growing up, and particularly every white kid should read. But, there he talks about, he's looking in Birmingham, and those of you, who've been there, if you haven't been there, you can imagine there's a church on every corner, right? And in Birmingham, and the steeples kind of dominate the skyline. And he's looking at that skyline and just saying, like, who are these people, right? Who are these churches, and who is their God? He asked. And then he has this just line that stayed with me so much. He says, who are these people who are sitting safely behind the anesthetizing power of stained glass windows? And I can honestly say, like, now I was Baptist, so we didn't have stained glass windows. But I would say that was in many ways the role that the church played in my early psyche. Instead of enlivening my conscience, right, to social justice and inequalities all around me, it dulled it. Like, that was its job, right, was to make me not accountable in many ways. And not accidentally, right? But the whole way the theology was constructed, what we sang, we would sing hymn that had the lyrics, wash me and I will be whiter than snow, Lord, whiter than snow, right? So there's all this kind of whiteness and purity and all that stuff. And then I lived through the desegregation of Jackson Public Schools. That happened when I was in third grade, 1976, right? 22 years after Brown v. Board of Education. Jackson Public Schools finally got around to integrating all of its schools. And what did my church have to say about that? Like, absolutely nothing. Total conspiracy of silence, like, to help explain to us little kids what was going on. We had our first Black teachers, our first Black classmates, and like whole social world like turns around and like nobody's telling us what's up. Like, why is this happening? And because we'd have to explain what led, we have to explain segregation to explain desegregation. And we didn't want to talk about that. So, yeah.
There was one quick question, but this all goes together, and I'll ask one more larger question, but I do want to open it up to you all in the group. The question was, is the doctrine of discovery actually taught in public schools? As the doctrine of discovery, what is your?
I don't think, certainly it wasn't in my case, and that includes like graduate degree at Emory University, right? Yeah. So I could pretty safely say it's not being taught as such. And so like you get pieces of it, right?
Right.
But you don't really get like, oh, that's they're claiming that, right? They're claiming that this country is a promised land for white. That's what they're claiming, right? You don't quite get that.
God, well, and my classes were a little different, but we didn't call it the doctrine of discovery. Yeah. We did have, what we did do is try to look at original documents and get the kids to see who the players actually were. They looked, but so your journey is one that many of us, I mean, I have close friends who've been telling me the same kinds of things that you're uncovering in the book is amazing. So you really had a journey of truth telling and then a search for reconciliation and restitution. If we look at the first part of it, the truth telling part of it, and by the way, as we were getting ready for this, close friend who consults in schools sent me yesterday the permission slip that kids in Miami-Dade public schools are having to get from their parents before they're allowed to read a book written by an African American. This came over. This is what's happening right now. So what do you think the role of the church is with respect to truth telling? And do you think we should be substituting education for children if they're not getting it in the public schools? I'm sure you've gotten a lot of responses if you've been talking to folks.
I mean, the first thing I want to say is, I think the biggest thing we've got to get over is thinking that we're incidental to the story.
Okay.
Right? Because I think
as the church, yes.
Yeah, that Christianity and the church is not incidental to this story. I think that's the biggest thing we've got to get over, you know, and it's everything from just saying, okay, well, like what I've been encouraging every church I talk to is like, why is your church on this piece of land? Why here? And I think if every predominantly white church answered that question honestly, we'd have like a revival in the country, right? Of kind of real thinking about racial justice, our own. So like, you know, I don't actually know the history here, but I can imagine, right? Is it part of redlining, right, in the city? Was it party to a racially restricted deed covenants in the neighborhood? What does that mean, right? And you know, if it's a plant from another church, like why didn't it go south instead of north, right? When they were deciding where the fertile fields were, right, for a new church plant. Why did it, you know, be here? Where was it in the civil rights movement? Like, what did it do? What did it preach? What sermons were preached? You know, all those kinds of things. I think kind of getting in White Too Long, I profile a predominantly white First Baptist Church of Macon, Georgia, that actually was the parent church of my parents went to a church plant of theirs on the working class side of Macon, but you know, they have this history that there's actually two First Baptist churches in Macon. One's white, one's black. They used to be the same church in 1820, right? And it was enslaved people going to church with their enslavers, right? In First Baptist Church of Macon. And after the Civil War, they split, and then they ignored each other for 150 years, right? And they're literally right around the corner from each other. And so the part of the story is like, how do we surface that history? How do we tell the story? And how do we try to be in community together with that kind of dissonance, right? And difficult, very difficult. And they've been working on this for more than a decade now. So anyway, because I think we read, oh, well, the Pope did this, or the church said that, or this theology said this, but we don't take that to be what it was at the time, which was a powerful moral mandate for what people were doing. Right. And I also say this too, like this is, you know, if at any time in our entire history, a majority of white Christians had stood up and said, yeah, let's don't do that, we wouldn't have. Right. We just wouldn't have. There was enough of us to stop it. And we didn't. So I think just kind of owning that piece. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have another question on that.
Coming back to your question about the origin of why is this church here? In the memorial hall next door, there's a round stained glass window, maybe about this big. It's the only thing that came from our original building or our previous building, which was in Adams Morgan, and the neighborhood was changing.
Yeah.
Demographically. So moved
I mean, it's probably the story of 90+% of predominantly white churches in the country is something like that.
See the round window in the church in Adams Morgan. It faces the street. He has a modern window in the round space.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Luke,
I'm not sure
we
many
have a question. We have one online, but she's already asked one question, so we'll go ahead.
Your demographic polling hat, you talked about the white Christian majority shrinking and shrinking. Combine that with your knowledge of voting patterns. How far off into the future do you see an inflection point?
No, it's a great question. Here's the challenge is that I'll use just one subset of white Christians in the country that get a lot of attention because they're strong support for Donald Trump, and that is white evangelicals, right? The kind of group that I grew up in. So they have shrunk from if I take that same time period, I just use that one subset. In the early 2000s, they were about a quarter of the country. Today are 14.3% of the country today. So they've gone from being about a quarter to 14.3% of the country. But they still make up about 19 to 20% of voters. So they turn out to vote at rates that are much higher than average Americans. So it means that there's two ways in which their voices get amplified. And so one of them is just pure turnout. They turn out at rates higher. Part of that's they tend to be older. And so that's both a kind of long-term detriment, right? Their median age is 56, but older people vote. Right. So it also means that they at the present, their numbers get amplified that way. The other reason why their voices get amplified is because they have become so loaded into the Republican Party. Right. So they vote 85% for Trump in 2020, 81% in 2016, 85% in 2020. So they actually went up in that time. And so that means they make up about a third of the Republican Party. So when you got a group that makes up a third of one of our two political parties, they've got a megaphone. Right inside the party. So I think that's partially what's happening is that we get this kind of outsized two-way kind of partisan megaphone and a kind of turnout megaphone that gives them kind of outsized power.
But play into the future.
Yeah.
Where do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm just being crass about it, I'm a long-term Republican strategist or something. I'm not happy with what I see. This kind of demographic. This will tell you another story. The two parties today, we are increasingly seeing the Republican Party becoming a kind of white Christian party. 7 in 10 Republicans are white Christians in a country that's 42% white and Christian. Right. The Democratic Party is about 25% white and Christian. Right. So that tells you partially this kind of identity struggle, right? This is like a really unhealthy, when you got like race, religion, and partisanship, like all pulling the same direction, like it's a powerful drug, and kind of a dangerous cocktail, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Allison?
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question about the memoir component of your work in your books. And I ask as someone who also was raised in the Southern Baptist Church. I'm from North Florida.
Oh, yeah.
Families from Texas.
We'll count you as the South. Yeah, even though we'll count you as the South, even though you're from Florida.
I learned recently one of my ancestors was the first Baptist preacher at the First Baptist Church in Custer County, Oklahoma, when Europeans colonized that area. So my question is, how did you summon and sustain the moral courage to kind of trouble inherited family narratives and look at the more difficult narratives? And how, if you were able, did you find a way to talk to family or ancestors about that? That's a bit of a personal question.
No, it's tricky.
No, and in fact, the online question was, how do you bring up the identity issue without creating defensiveness in the people you meet? So I think they go together. This is.
Well, I did. Well, I'll tell you, it's maybe not the most noble emotion or the noblest emotion. I think I got started like moving into this space because I was angry. And I was angry because I felt like I'd been lied to. Yeah. Right. And that I felt like my like I got a seminary degree from a Southern Baptist seminary. Right. I only have like 2 professors that I think told me the truth out of the entire 4 years at seminary. Right. About the domination. And then I started thinking back. I was like, okay, well, yeah, nobody told me the truth about desegregation in our public school system. Like Medgar Evers, it's a great new book, by the way, by Joy Reid on Medgar Murray Evers. I'll recommend it to you all. He was killed 9 miles from my driveway where I grew up, right in Jackson, Mississippi. When I graduated from high school, I was a valedictorian in my class. I'd learned everything that Jackson Public Schools told me I needed to learn to be a successful human being. I had never heard his name.
Wow. Wow.
Right. And I mean, it's just, yeah, I think I had heard Emmett Till's name, but I knew very little about the story.
Yeah.
So I'd heard his name, but didn't really know the story. And I sure didn't know that the last thing that Medgar Evers was trying to do when he was killed was integrate First Baptist Church and Galloway Memorial Methodist Church in downtown Jackson, which were the churches of the mayor and the governor, respectively. That was the last campaign he was working on, was the desegregating churches that he was killed for. And the man who pulled the trigger, Byron De La Beckwith, was a member in good standing of an Episcopal church in Greenwood, Mississippi, who had gone on record in a letter to the editor in the Greenwood newspaper saying that if any Black people tried to come to his church, he would be standing on the steps with a pistol, keeping them out, right? And so it's a white Christian man who very much cares about Christianity and keeping the church segregated, right? He even right in that letter, he even writes that when he's like, if I go to heaven, I'm going to be going to the white part of heaven, right? And if I go to hell, I'm going to be going to the white part of hell. But like it's that kind of virulence. So I was mad that I really had been lied to by my teachers, by pastors, all that stuff. But in terms of like doing it, so I did talk a lot with my parents, my family, trying to get the history right. But I did tell them, like, I'm not going to give this to you to prove, right? So I want to have these conversations. And I didn't send it to my parents, for example, until it was off to the publisher. Because I just didn't want the temptation to get pushback and have to like deal with like, do I change something? Do I not? And I was trying to be careful, not to do unnecessary injury, right? So I wasn't out to like burn the house down, but I was out to be honest about how it impacted my family and my family's life and journey. And it continues to be a struggle. I didn't find out until after the book came out. This is like one interesting example of the goodness of having these conversations. After White Too Long came out, and I'd done that memoir work, I was talking to my parents, and my mom said, look, one other story we didn't talk about because I didn't even think about it, but my grandfather was a deacon at East Macon Baptist Church, which is that church I was just mentioning. And one of his jobs in 1963 and 64 was to stand on the steps of the church and make sure no Black people entered the congregation. That was his official role as a deacon. Not a wink, wink, nod, nod, but like who's going to do it this Sunday, right? And one of his roles, he was ex-Navy, kind of, rough around the edges, sheet metal worker. He was essentially a bouncer on the outside of the church, right? And then we were going to have this whole other conversation about that. But I think stories beget stories, right? And I think that's part of the power of them. Like even this story you just told, right? This little story about the window. There's probably a whole other set of stories that connect to that, right? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I guess I have two questions. I guess my first question is, it is interesting because what you're saying relates to what Paul said, in Christ, there's no male and female, there's no division of races. Everyone is part of the kingdom of God. So these people are not recognizing that passage, that command in Christianity. It's like they've compartmentalized it. But I have a larger question, and this goes to the final chapter in your book. And there are still more enough of us to decisively derail the future of democracy in America. And we wish to do otherwise. We can no longer disingenuously pretend that democracy and the doctrine of discovery are or ever were compatible. How can we reconcile two fundamentally opposing worldviews? Democracy and the doctrine of discovery are not compatible. So how do we reconcile this white Christian America concept that's embodied in our current political identity politics versus a pluralistic idea of democracy representing everyone?
Yeah, two quick, we're close on time, but two quick comments. So one, that passage you read, there's a Bible that Fisk University has that was printed in England actually, but it was printed for use with masters and slaves, right? It like talks about it as it's kind of nicknamed the Slave Bible, but it's printed particularly for the purpose of being used with enslaved people. In this case, in the West Indies. But what it basically does is it goes through the Bible and it actually excises texts that could be problematic. So it has, for example, in the book of Exodus, it has the story of the captivity of the Israeli people, but it does not have their liberation in the book of Exodus. It has Ephesians, slaves obey your masters, but it does not have that passage you just read from Galatians about in Christ there's no slave nor free, no male nor female. They're excised. And so it tells you something about how deliberate like this project was in many ways. But on what I'm hoping to do is I think kind of surface this claim as clearly as I can so that it can be like defeated finally, right? I think we just kicked this can down the road. We've soft pedaled it. We've pretended it's not quite what it is. But in many ways, like trying to say the quiet part out loud, and all you got to do is that we have records of the quiet part being said out loud. Just kind of remember what was there. And I think today where we see this is, the handle that we use today in the last few years is Christian nationalism, right? That's the term, but it's really described. That's not new, right? That Christian nationalism is really describing this impulse that goes all the way back before the founding of the country, just this claim that this is a country, a promised land for European Christians. That is the central claim of Christian nationalism, right? And I think that's how we see it being embodied in our politics today.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think there is no reconciling them, right?
We can't thank you enough. You're traveling all over the U.S., the world. We thank you so much for taking this time to be with us. We obviously have a lot more work to do. We didn't even look at reparations and restitution. Yeah. And the Presbyterian Church has just established an office for the repair of historic harms. We'll see what goes with that. But here we are amongst ourselves. And we do meet every Sunday at 9:15. And we've got some really incredible discussions. Robbie, we thank you so much. Next Sunday, we have coming Dr. Denise Hopkins, who will be looking at David Carr's book, Holy Resilience. How did Judaism and Christianity manage trauma? Carr claims that suffering and the survival of it was written into the Bible. We'll look briefly at Ezekiel, daughter Zion, and Lamentations, the suffering servant, and Isaiah, Jesus' crucifixion as the founding trauma of Christianity, and Paul as the traumatized apostle, as examples of how our ancestors in faith endured trauma. We'll also consider the dangers of biblical self-blame as the primary response to trauma and look at a path to recovery. So thank you all so much for joining us this morning. Thank you, Robbie, for taking your time and spending the time to come back and be with us. You're always welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for the work you're doing here. Appreciate it. It's important. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, I'll see you. We'll take a moment.
All right.